How did World War I change America? In World War I, the use of the assembly line to mass produce weapons. The most important factor to remember about both world wars was that America did not suffer relative civilian casualties nor relative destroyed infrastructure. Since America fought the wars primarily outside of the United States, of course it showed us as one of the world's superpowers. But also that, in a world of rising technology, we couldn't just be concerned with at home problems, we had to be part of the international politics. Many advancements in weapons, including the introduction of tanks and the first machine guns, and strong international trade between Europe and America. This was also the time for rising on the home front with the creation of the Affordable Car and Highway System. How did the Roaring Twenties come to be? The years of war led to a reaction in the 1920s when many people were determined to have as much fun as possible. As prices fell, people had more money to spend on enjoying themselves. For many, the Roaring Twenties were a time of fun, parties, prosperity, jazz, music, and frantic dancing. During the war, women had taken jobs previously closed to them. Although they lost most of these jobs when the soldiers returned, they did not surrender their freedom. In 1920, all women got the right to vote. Flappers were young, liberated women in the 1920s who smoked in public, wore short dresses, and drove their own cars. This produced a great change in American society. For the first time, women began to make a mark of their own. Excuse me. Instead of having to play second fiddle to men, women began to demand recognition. Many of the most famous film stars of the 1920s were women. In the 1930s, it was women film stars who attracted all of the attention. But the changes to the lives of women in the 1920s did not stop at the ways that they dressed and behaved in public. Financially, many young women became independent of their parents and no longer had to live at home. This meant that women became more independent and could decide for themselves much more easily. How did the U.S. respond socially and economically to World War I, causing the Great Depression? The Great Depression was triggered by the 1929 crash of the stock market. Throughout the 1930s, over 9,000 banks failed. Bank deposits were uninsured, and thus, as banks failed, people simply lost their savings. With the stock market crash and the fears of the further economic woes, individuals from all classes stopped purchasing items. This then led to a reduction in the number of items produced and thus a reduction in the workforce. As people lost their jobs, they were unable to keep up with paying for items they had bought through installment plans and their items were repossessed. As businesses began failing, the government created the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930 to help protect American companies. This charged a high tax for imports, thereby leading to less trade between America and foreign countries, along with some economic retaliation. While not a direct cause of the Great Depression, the drought that occurred in the Mississippi Valley in 1930 was of such proportions that many could not even pay their taxes or other debts and had to sell their farms for non-profit to themselves. This area was nicknamed the Dust Bowl. How did the U.S. respond to economic and social change after World War II, which helped the country recover, and reform America? The Emergency Banking Act, established March 9th, provided the president with the means to reopen viable banks and regulate banking. The Economy Act of March 20th cut federal costs through reorganizing of and cuts in salaries and veterans' pensions. The Beer Wine Revenue Act of March 22nd legalized and taxed wine and beer. The Civilian Conservation Corps Act, or the CCC, 3 million young men between the ages of 18 to 25 found work in road building, forestry labor, and flood control through the establishment of the CCC. Federal Emergency Relief Act on May 12th established a Federal Emergency Relief Administration to distribute $500 million to states and localities for relief. Administered by Harry Hopkins for relief on for wages or public works, that federal agency would not eventually pay out about $3 billion. Agricultural Adjustment Act on May 12th established the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to decrease crop surpluses by subsidizing farmers who voluntarily cut back on production. The Thomas Amendment to the Agricultural Adjustment Act permitted the president to inflate the currency in various ways. The Tennessee Valley Authority Act, the Federal Securities Act, and all of these others acts basically gave America all of these powers to give and receive various forms of money. The United States responded to World War II by domestically. The war ended the Great Depression as hundreds of thousands of people, many of them women, went to the defense industries. At the same time, African Americans made significant strides toward achieving their political, economic, and social rights. The root of World War II, which eventually pitted Germany, Japan, and Italy, the Axis, against the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, the Allies, lay in the militaristic ideologies and expansionist policies of Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. The weak response of the European democracies to fascist aggression and American isolationism allowed the Axis powers to gain the upper hand initially. The United States did not enter the war until after the Japanese bombed the American fleet in Pearl Harbor on Hawaii on December 7, 1941. America's capacity to produce hundreds of thousands of tanks, airplanes, and ships for itself and its allies proved a crucial factor in Allied success. How did the United States respond to the Cold War? The Cold War touched many aspects of American social and cultural life, from the civil rights movement to survivalism, from Hollywood to the universities. The nuclear threat and the communism menace lurking behind it brought the National Defense Education Act, the interstate highway system, and growing mistrust of government by both liberals and conservatives. In ways sometimes blatant, sometimes subtle, the Cold War left its mark on activities ranging from art and poetry to movies and comic books. Sports events became particularly prominent venues for rivalry, beginning with the London Olympics in 1948 and peaking every 4 years thereafter. Visiting artists, traveling exhibitions, and other cultural exchanges, both formal and informal, sometimes helped ease Cold War tensions. The civil defense was introduced. The new dimensions of nuclear war terrified the world and the American people. The sheer power of nuclear weapons and the increasing likelihood of such an attack on the United States necessitated a greater response than had yet been required of civil defense. During the Cold War, civil defense was seen largely and defended against and recovering from an attack involving nuclear weapons. After the end of the Cold War, the focus moved from defense against nuclear war to defense against a terrorist attack possibly involving chemical or biological weapons. In the context of the United States, this eventually led to the replacement of the United States Civil Defense with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA.